Good evening and welcome. I'm Jonathan Tepperman, Managing Editor of Foreign Affairs, and this is Foreign Affairs Live. Thanks so much for coming, for braving the weather and Obama's motorcade, and our loyal protesters for coming inside. Thank you for leaving your placards and protest banners outside. In fact, the protesters were such a bedraggled crowd, I thought about inviting them in. But I realized it would spoil all these wonderful conspiracy theories about how the council is the center of every nefarious Zionist plot to control the world. And I thought that would be so disappointing that it was better for everybody that we kept things this way. We're here tonight, of course, to debate Iran, probably the most pressing topic facing the country, if not the world at the moment. To present the case for and against an attack, we have two great recent foreign affairs authors. Matt Kroenig on my far left. Matt is Kroenig, Stanton Nuclear Security Fellow here at the Council from 2010 to 2011. He was a special advisor in the Office of the Secretary of Defense. And he's a professor at Georgetown and the author for us of Time to Attack Iran, Why a Strike is the Least Bad Option from our Jan-Feb 2012 issue. Sitting to my immediate left and making the opposing case is Colin Kahl. Colin is also a professor at Georgetown. Colin's a senior fellow at the Center for New American Security. From 2009 to 2011, he was a Deputy Assistant Secretary of Defense and Matt, sorry, but I have to point this out, Matt's boss at the Defense Department.
And he'll be voting on my tenure next year at Georgetown. So.
Excellent.
I've already cast my vote.
And in the March-April issue of Foreign Affairs, Colin responded to Matt's article with a piece of his own, Not Time to Attack Iran, Why War Should Be a Last Resort. Before we get into things and I turn things over to Colin and Matt, I have a few housekeeping notes that I want to cover. First, I'd like to remind all of you what you hopefully know already, which is that Foreign Affairs and the Council on Foreign Relations, while we're accused of many things, strive very hard to be nonpartisan. This means that we don't endorse any particular position ourselves. It means we don't even necessarily agree with everything that we publish. What we do believe in is debate and the need to air the various sides of important and controversial questions, and that's what we're here to do tonight. We're confident that the merits or weaknesses of various arguments will make themselves clear in the telling. And we're confident that if we do our jobs right, we'll manage to piss everybody off in the process, which it seems like we're well on our way to doing. We're going to start with short statements from our speakers, followed by a couple of questions from me, and then I'm going to open things up to the floor. When I do, I'd like you to follow the following procedure, please. Raise your hand, wait to be acknowledged, wait for the microphone when you get up, stand up, state your name and affiliation, and please stick to one question. And the operative word there is question. Finally, while we encourage tweeting, in fact, we have a live feed going, hashtag FALive, please silence your electronic devices. Now, we're going to get started. Before, Matt, I ask you to start talking. Since you published first, you get to talk first. I just want to review a few key developments from the last week, which you both can or cannot take into account as you talk. A week ago, just about last Friday, the IAEA presented new evidence that the Iranians have begun enriching uranium in an underground facility. Almost the same time, there was a new U.S. intelligence report arguing that there is no actual evidence of a concerted push to build a weapon by Iran. Now, that's an important distinction, evidence of a nuclear program, but at least according to the intelligence community, not necessarily a nuclear weapons program. Just yesterday or the day before, the foreign minister of Iran declared that the possession of nuclear weapons is a great sin, which may mean we can just stop now and all go home. Yesterday, North Korea, a state that is, at least to its critics, just as nutty and irrational as many argue Iran is, agreed to suspend its nuclear weapons program and to allow inspections. And today there's a report in the Washington Times that Russia has upgraded a radar installation in Syria to give Iran an advance warning of an impending attack. With all of that as background, Matt, take it away.
Great. Well, thank you very much for that introduction.
No attack on Iran! No attack on Iran! Both of these speakers are for an attack on Iran, now or later. It doesn't matter which one they say. They're both for an attack on Iran. They're both for war. There was sanctions on Iran long before there was any nuclear energy. So no attack on Iran.
Well, now the truth is out. I was hoping we wouldn't get to this until the end. How do you feel now, Matt?
Good.
Comfortable?
Well, I think she took Colin's spot, basically, so I'll just go ahead and
I
respond
think she
to her.
assumed you and I were actually sitting in the same chair, and she wanted this.
Well, thanks for that introduction, Jonathan. It's really a pleasure to be here at the Council on Foreign Relations in New York. And it's really a pleasure to be here on stage with my old friend and colleague, Colin Kahl. Colin and I have worked together in a variety of capacities over the past 10 years. And something you might not know about Colin was actually a national championship debater in college at the University of Michigan. So I'm sure he's feeling pretty confident tonight about this quasi-debate format. But what he doesn't know, though, is that he's in for a real challenge, because I once got an A- in a public speaking class in 7th grade. So real clash of the titans here. Don't say you weren't warned, Colin. But more seriously, turning to the topic of the discussion tonight, Iran's rapidly advancing nuclear program poses the greatest emerging national security challenge to the United States. And so deciding how to deal with this challenge, I think, is the most important decision facing the U.S. government right now. And as I see it, there are only 3 ways that this dispute is going to be resolved. On one hand, we could get some kind of diplomatic settlement with Iran. Second, we could simply acquiesce to a nuclear-armed Iran. Or third, we or Israel could conduct a military strike designed to prevent Iran from acquiring nuclear weapons. Now, obviously, if we could solve this diplomatically, that would be ideal. But I think at this point, the diplomatic option is highly unlikely to work. It's really hard to imagine any overlap between what Iran's supreme leader would be willing to agree to in terms of curbs on his nuclear program, and what would simultaneously reassure the West and reassure Washington that Iran's nuclear program no longer poses a threat. So second, we could acquiesce to a nuclear-armed Iran. But a nuclear-armed Iran would pose a grave threat to international peace and security. Nuclear-armed Iran would lead to further proliferation of nuclear weapons in the Middle East and around the world. Nuclear-armed Iran would be more aggressive in terms of its coercive diplomacy, support for proxy and terrorist groups. So this could lead to an even more crisis-prone Middle East. And if Iran had nuclear weapons, every single crisis in the Middle East could become a nuclear crisis. Now, I don't think that Iran would intentionally launch a suicidal nuclear war, but given the inherent instabilities in the region, any crisis between Iran or Israel or Iran and the United States could escalate and result in inadvertent or accidental nuclear exchange, which could very well, given Israel's small size, mean the end of the State of Israel. And once Iran has developed the requisite delivery capabilities, which some experts estimate could be within 5 years, it could also mean a nuclear attack against the east coast of the United States. So a nuclear-armed Iran poses a grave threat to international peace and security. Both President Bush and President Obama have said a nuclear-armed Iran is unacceptable, and we must do whatever we can to prevent it. So this leaves us with the third option, the military option. The military option is an unattractive one. As I say in the piece, there are significant downside risks. That said, there are certain things that a military strike on Iran's key nuclear facilities could accomplish. The United States could almost certainly destroy Iran's key nuclear facilities. We could set back Iran's nuclear program. It's difficult to estimate, but I estimate somewhere between 3 and 10 years, with the hope that eventually Iran ends up permanently without nuclear weapons. So there is a significant benefit to a strike. There are also significant risks, as I point out, most importantly, Iranian military retaliation. But as I point out in the piece, I think Iranian military retaliation would be less severe than many people believe, and that also the United States could put in place a mitigation strategy to mitigate against some of the risks of military action. So in sum, if the diplomatic track fails, and the United States is faced with this unattractive choice, really tough dilemma between simply acquiescing to a nuclear-armed Iran or conducting military action, I argue that we should conduct a surgical strike against Iran's key nuclear facilities, pull back and absorb an inevitable round of Iranian retaliation, and seek to quickly de-escalate the crisis. Now, in Colin's piece, Colin argues that we have some time to make a decision. And I don't disagree with that. It would depend on Iranian behavior. I think Colin thinks we have more time than I do, but we might have some time. Colin also argues that the consequences of a strike would be grave. I think he thinks the consequences would be more serious than I do, but I don't disagree with him. There are serious risks to a strike. But I think unless Colin is willing to argue that nuclear-armed Iran is better than a strike, or that a diplomatic breakthrough is just around the corner, I don't think anything he says in his piece calls into question my basic conclusion, which is that at this point, given this set of bad options, strike is the least bad option. So, thank you.
Thank you, Matthew. Colin, it's all yours.
Well, great. Well, thanks to everybody for coming out on this dreary day. So basically, in my response piece to Matt's, I argue that he follows many of the arguments that were made in the lead up to the Iraq War, and I argue actually a lot of the same mistakes. He presents the threat from Iran as grave and imminent. He dismisses the prospect for a diplomatic solution while claiming that he desires one. He exaggerates the benefits of war while downplaying the escalatory risks and the spillover consequences, and completely ignores post-war scenarios. And I argue in repeating these mistakes, Matt's advocacy for a near-term U.S. attack on Iran is no wiser than the neoconservative drive for war was about a decade ago. So I want to go through some of my arguments in about 5 minutes, but my sense is that some of you have had a chance to read both pieces. Could I just get a quick show of hands of those who are able to read my piece so I can kind of
Lie to make them feel better.
Right. No, you don't have to. That's fine. Great. Well, for those of you who didn't, it's not that long, so you can do it. Basically, my article advances several arguments. First, the Iranian nuclear threat is growing, but it is not yet imminent. U.S. and Israeli officials calculate that it would take 6 to 7 months for Iran to enrich uranium to weapons-grade level, about a year to generate a crude testable device, and several years to generate a device sophisticated enough and small enough to fit on a missile. But none of those timelines even begin until the Supreme Leader, Ayatollah Ali Khamenei, makes the decision to go, and our intelligence community has been clear, and the Israeli intelligence community doesn't disagree on this, that Khamenei hasn't yet made that decision. And in fact, it's highly likely he won't make that decision in the near future. The reason being that to divert the LEU stockpile, the low-enriched uranium stockpile, and enrich to weapons grade, he'd have to use declared facilities, which means he'd get caught, which means that he's not likely to make that decision until they can rapidly compress the timeline for generating a bomb or generate new covert facilities, both of which are years away. So we are not on the precipice of having to decide between giving up on sanctions and diplomacy or going to war, which is the argument that Matt frames it. We have a lot of time to make this decision. Second, the notion that a surgical strike and that you could do a surgical strike and then limit escalation is a dangerous mirage. Right? War is not a clean, calibrated exercise where you move little chess pieces around on a game board, anticipating every move and every counter move. Okay? It is a messy, dangerous, violent affair, and a war between the United States and Iran will be that. Now, don't get me wrong. The United States would win that war. In a tactical and operational sense, there's no doubt who would win, but it would be an extraordinarily violent affair. First, the type of attack that Matt advocates would hit the crown jewel of the Iranian regime. So the notion that we would be able to communicate to them that it was limited, that we have limited aims, is a joke. They would perceive this as a shot directly at the regime. In fact, even when a nuclear scientist dies or something blows up in the middle of a desert in Iran, they believe we're after regime change. If we go after half a dozen of their nuclear programs, they will believe the same thing, and they will retaliate not in a small way, but likely in a very large way. Moreover, they don't trust us, they don't like us, they have no way of communicating with us, and the fog of war will be intense. There's all sorts of room for miscalculation. They will be supremely worried that our first strike is just that, a first strike in a campaign. They will have all sorts of incentives to use their arsenal of missiles naval weapons, etc., before they lose them to the Americans. And by the way, they will start doing a bunch of things, even for defensive purposes, like dispersing their ballistic missiles, dispersing their anti-ship cruise missiles, turning on their integrated air defense, taking their mines out of storage, moving their submarines out to sea. All of those things will be looked upon by the U.S. military as extraordinarily provocative and threatening, and we will have no way of knowing whether it's for defensive or offensive reasons, which means we will also have reasons to preempt. All right? The room for miscalculation is intense. And lastly, the type of retaliation that Matt would like to turn the other cheek to, such as retaliation against our diplomats in Iraq or harassment of shipping in the Strait of Hormuz, are precisely the types of retaliation that it would be very difficult for any president to turn the other cheek to in the context of a heated presidential campaign. I just think it's unrealistic to think that we can keep this conflict very, very small. Third, I would argue that a surgical attack along the lines that Matt advocates would actually not buy very much time. It would only buy a few years. I don't know where Matt's calculation of up to a decade comes from. I've not seen any other calculations that put it up nearly that high. In all likelihood, Iran would reconstitute its program, and it would do so in a way that would be largely invisible from the international community. Why? Because they would use the attack as an excuse to kick out the IAEA inspectors and distance themselves from the NPT. And they would also make the final decision, a decision they have not yet made, to go all the way for a weapon. So the attack itself becomes a self-fulfilling prophecy. Right? It's not the least bad option to prevent them from getting a nuclear weapon. It's the most likely route in the near term to have them make that decision. All right? And we would end up finding ourselves having to contain a nuclear Iran on the back end. So, Matt likes to portray this as this choice between war now or containing later. The point I make in the article is actually a war in the near term is more likely to be a prelude to a containment regime than a substitute for it. So I conclude my article by saying now is not the time, and actually the timing matters. Okay? Now is not the time. Pressure is finally starting to hit the Iranians. They're showing willingness of coming back to the negotiating table. We need to take a breath. Let that process play out and see if we can start with some confidence-building measures and move towards a diplomatic solution. Because of all the options, force is the one that we should employ last, not first.
Thank you both very much. Let me start with a question for you, Matt. It relates to something that Colin said. It's a point that some of your critics have picked up on as well, and that's this tension that exists in your argument over whether the Iranian regime is rational or not. And here's the tension. The first part of your argument that Iran can't be trusted with a bomb. The implication there is that the Iranian regime is not rational. They're irrational and will not behave like other rational states that possess a weapon. Yet your argument that an American attack could be calibrated and that clear signals from the United States would limit the Iranian response implies that Iran would respond rationally to those signals. So there's the tension. How can both of these things be true?
Yeah, thanks very much for raising that question. You're right that that's something that critics on the blogosphere have pointed out, and I think it's an unfair criticism. And I think actually the reason why both of those things are true were pretty clear in the article, but let me just take a moment here to address it. Right now, we think that Iran restrains its foreign policy because it fears a major U.S. Military retaliation. So in the event of a conflict, in the event of a strike on Iran's nuclear facilities, it's going to lack nuclear weapons. It's not going to feel like it can deter a major U.S. response. It's going to be afraid of a major U.S. response. On the other hand, if Iran acquires nuclear weapons, it'll have a counter-deterrent. It could threaten nuclear war in order to deter a major U.S. military response. So we think that with nuclear weapons, Iran would be emboldened for that reason. With the cover provided by a nuclear weapon, it could be more aggressive in terms of its support to terrorist groups, support to proxies, coercive diplomacy. And even if Iran is rational, which I think it is, I think since 1979 we've seen that Iran has been fairly pragmatic and rational in terms of its foreign policy. But even if Iran is not a suicidal state, there's a lot that can go wrong when it possesses nuclear weapons. The United States, after all, isn't a suicidal state, but we are willing to risk nuclear war in the Cuban Missile Crisis. because the Soviet Union was trying to forward deploy missiles on the territory of an ally. So I think it's just implausible to think that Iran also wouldn't be willing to risk nuclear war over things that maybe they shouldn't be risking nuclear war over. And we came very close a number of times during the Cold War to nuclear war. And I think that given the instabilities in the Middle East, given the nuclear balance and the nuclear capabilities between Iran and Israel and Iran and the United States, there's a real possibility that things could spiral out of control and result in a nuclear exchange. So that explains this apparent contradiction. There's not a contradiction. Iran would be emboldened with nuclear weapons. I think it's pretty clear.
Colin, do you want to respond on this question of deterrence?
Yeah, so Matt admits that they're not a suicidal state. They're not likely to launch a nuclear war nor transfer weapons to non-state actors. So let's put that aside. I think he's right that an Iran that had a nuclear weapon would be emboldened to use its proxies and coercive diplomacy more aggressively. The part that Matt's probably wrong about, though, is whether these crises would turn into nuclear crises. Iran has a powerful incentive to not have them turn into crises. The crises between Iran and Israel aren't between two neighboring states. Iran would be projecting influence into the Levant, into Israel's neighborhood, specifically through groups like Hezbollah, Hamas, Palestinian Islamic Jihad, etc. Iran uses proxy conflicts precisely because it doesn't want direct confrontations with powerful states, which means that it has no incentive to turn these peripheral conflicts into existential conflicts in the case of a nuclear crisis. So I would like Matt to explain what type of crisis between Iran and Israel would be in Iran's interest to turn into a nuclear crisis. What's also strange to me is Matt's a very smart proliferation scholar, and he has a new article coming out in an international organization. And it suggests that historically, when you look at nuclear crises, not only have they never escalated, but that countries that have nuclear superiority and which have more resolve in those conflicts because the conflicts matter more to them win those crises. They make the other side blink. Those are precisely the conflicts and crises we would expect in the Levant between Israel and Iran. Israel will have conventional superiority, nuclear superiority, and because the conflict will be on their border, not Iran's, they'll have the balance of resolve in their favor, which means Iran will not turn those crises into nuclear crises because they're rational, which he admits, and even if they did, they'll blink. All right? So Matt's own research suggests that. And what's interesting is, and I'll conclude on this one, he also talks about the United States and Iran getting into nuclear crises. I would imagine he's talking about the Gulf. But what's interesting is the same article from Matt, and this is a quote from Matt, quote, "Proliferation in Iran would disadvantage the United States by forcing it to compete with Iran in risk-taking rather than in more traditional arenas. On the other hand, the findings of this article, his article, also suggest that the United States could fare well in future nuclear crises. As long as the United States maintains nuclear superiority over Iran, a prospect that seems highly likely for years to come, Washington will frequently be able to achieve its basic goals in nuclear confrontations with Tehran." Unquote. Not my words, his words.
Matt, do you want to respond to this dirty trick of having your own words used against you?
Well, the thing that Colin doesn't mention is that the theoretical model that this academic article uses, first developed by Thomas Schelling, who subsequently won the Nobel Prize in economics, assumes that each of these nuclear crises has a probability of escalating into nuclear war. And in fact, nuclear deterrence wouldn't work if there wasn't some non-zero probability of nuclear war. If countries thought there was no probability that nuclear weapons would ever be used, they wouldn't be deterred. So in each of these crises, there is a risk that things spiral out of control and could result in nuclear catastrophe for both countries. So if you look into the future possible crises between, again, Iran and Israel, Iran and the United States, these would all have the possibility of escalating into a nuclear exchange. And Colin says that it's unlikely that you can imagine the United States and Iran in these kind of nuclear conflicts. But again, think to the Cold War, the things we were willing to risk nuclear war over, the Soviet Union forward deploying missiles on the territory of an ally. So if we look at some of the plans currently being developed in think tanks in Washington about how we would deal with a nuclear-armed Iran, one of the things that we say is that, well, we'd of course have to extend our nuclear umbrella to our allies and partners in the region, extend our nuclear umbrella to Saudi, to Gulf states, to Israel. Of course, we'd essentially be threatening to fight nuclear war on their behalf. It's kind of an inherently incredible threat. As Charles de Gaulle asked during the Cold War, would the United States really be willing to trade New York for Paris in a nuclear war? What we'd essentially be doing with a deterrence and containment regime against a nuclear-armed Iran would be threatening to trade New York for Riyadh, which is something we might not be willing to do. But in order to try to make that credible to both our allies and to the Iranians, we'd almost certainly forward deploy U.S. troops, U.S. nuclear weapons on the territory of those countries, something we've done in the past in Europe and in East Asia, in order to make sure that we get dragged into any conflict. And it's possible that Iran could make a nuclear threat in response to that, to forward deploying nuclear weapons on the territory of, say, Saudi. Or if we just think back a few weeks ago, there were direct U.S. and Iranian counter threats over the Strait of Hormuz. How do those play out if Iran has nuclear weapons? And Iran, instead of the U.S. Fifth Fleet being able to confidently say, we'll reopen the strait in 2 weeks, Iran says, if you attack our Navy, we'll respond with nuclear weapons. So I think that we're kidding ourselves if we say that a nuclear-armed Iran doesn't pose a real threat. And I think we're kidding ourselves if we think that nuclear weapons will never be used again because they haven't been used in 50 years.
Okay, thank you, Matt. Colin, I can tell that you're about to explode, but in the interest of moving the conversation further, I want to ask you a question. And this is the one point in your article that left me a little bit confused, and the same goes for your comments. What's your bottom line? What is your red line? Is your position that we shouldn't strike Iran ever, or just not now? And if not now, then when?
Yeah.
What's the ultimate, and how do we know that when we've got there? And isn't that a very dangerous game to play?
Well, I don't think it's more dangerous than launching into a war before you have to. That strikes me as the most dangerous game. So in the relative risk equation, I think I'm still ahead on that one, especially since Iran's not on the cusp of having a nuclear weapon, which I think we've kind of agreed at. So why rush into war? I think the answer depends, and I know that that's uncomfortable, but it depends. I think there are certain things Iran could do that would increase the risk and that would make American policymakers ask some pretty tough questions. They could start installing large numbers of next-generation centrifuges, which would shrink their dash time. They could start building some of these new underground sites that they've promised to build. I'm not sure either one of that brings you to the brink of war. I think there are certain things they could do that would be very provocative, however, kicking out the IAEA, if they started to enrich to weapons-grade uranium, or if we discovered a wholly operational covert enrichment facility. I don't think any of those things are likely in the coming years. And I don't think any president of the United States or anybody else wants to be boxed in to say, under all circumstances, I would go to war with X, Y, and Z when we're talking about a decision that's probably years away. So I don't box myself into that either. A lot would depend how solid's the evidence, how big of a coalition can you form, how much diplomatic effort do you put into mitigating the consequences? Are there less overt means of achieving the same objectives? I would want to know the answers to all those questions if I was in a decision-making position.
But to simplify things, are you prepared to live with a nuclear Iran?
Well, I think that force has to maintain an option because I think a nuclear Iran is a dangerous outcome. But I'm not sure that the type of action that Matt is advocating makes sense now. I'm not sure it would make sense in a couple of years. There may be other alternatives. And I will say, by the way, if you're going to go after them in a military sense, it shouldn't be a surgical strike in the way that Matt indicates. You should knock them to the floor so they don't get back up. Which is actually another weird thing about Matt's article is that, and one of the arguments I make about why I think his approach is actually a prelude to containment, it basically punches them in the nose and then backs off, giving them every motivation to rebuild their program and leaving them a lot of military capability to retaliate against us for years to come, which would actually just make a containment regime like the decade-long containment regime we had against Saddam more likely and a more implacable Iranian foe on the back end of that.
Let's get Matt to talk about that. There's a lot of disagreement over how effective a U.S. or, for that matter, an Israeli strike would be. I think many observers are not nearly as optimistic as you are about how many years it would buy us. Even assuming your best case scenario, doesn't this just kick the can down the road and necessitate another strike at some point in the future against facilities that are even better protected than they would be today, leading to the kind of war that you're hoping to avoid this time?
Yeah. So one of the things that I argue in the piece, and maybe I don't make it clear enough, is that I argue that a U.S. strike should be conditioned on Iran crossing various red lines. So Colin mentions some of those red lines. So if Iran kicks out international inspectors, if Iran enriches beyond the 20% at which it's currently enriching, up to 90% if it installs advanced centrifuges in the facility at Qom. So at that point, those are all things, especially the first two, that would indicate that Iran is dashing toward a nuclear weapon. So if we do nothing, we're guaranteed to have a nuclear-armed Iran. So a strike might not guarantee. Colin, I think, points out in his piece that a strike doesn't guarantee that Iran never acquires nuclear weapons, and that's right. But if we do nothing in those situations, we're guaranteed that Iran will have nuclear weapons. So then what does a strike get us? Well, at best, it's possible, perhaps not likely, but it's possible that Iran would decide to give up at that point, to decide to rebuild these expensive nuclear infrastructure that could take years only to have it at risk for future strikes isn't worth it. It's possible that they could give up. Syria had a nuclear facility that was attacked in 2007 by the Israelis. As far as we can tell, Syria has decided not to reconstitute its nuclear program. So it's possible that they would give up. At a minimum, we buy time. And it's impossible to know exactly how much time you would buy because it depends on a number of assumptions about how the future would play out that we simply can't know. Does Iran decide to reconstitute its nuclear facilities at all? How quickly does it decide to reconstitute them? Is it able to get supplies on the international market that it still needs? What type of containment regime does the international community put in place? So it's impossible to know with any precision. I estimate 3 to 10 years, and I can go through how I get to that number later or offline. So time is valuable in and of itself. If we have to deal with a nuclear-armed Iran, I'd rather deal with it in 10 years than next year. And then also the 3 to 10 years creates a lot of space for something to happen where Iran doesn't end up with nuclear weapons. It creates space for more diplomacy, creates space for a possible indigenous regime change, creates space for maybe a future conflict that prevents Iran from developing nuclear weapons. And while there are certain things about a strike that make diplomacy harder, and I fully agree with that, there are also things that I think makes it easier. A lot of Iran experts say that at this point the supreme leader is going to be incredibly unlikely to make any concessions because he's months away from having a coveted nuclear weapon. And after a strike, though, that really changes the bargaining space, I think. If I were the supreme leader, I would be much more willing to trade away a shattered nuclear program than one that was within months of delivering me nuclear weapons. So I think there are significant upsides to a strike.
Thank you. Rather than ask more follow-ups myself, I'm going to open things up to the floor. You can follow on what's already been said or ask original questions yourself. The gentleman in the middle, in the back, I see a white cuff. Just wait for the microphone. Yeah, you. Wait for the microphone, please, and then give us your name and affiliation.
Thank you. My name is Simak Shojai. I am Dean of the School of Business at Central Connecticut State University, but I am not here tonight in that capacity, but just as an American Iranian. My question simply is, have any of you even started thinking about a third option, really helping Iranian people in no uncertain terms to retire the entire regime permanently? And you notice I didn't use the word regime change. I was very careful about that. I know how sensitive people are to those words. A permanent retirement of Iranian regime. We have had many opportunities in the past.
Thank you. Which of you would like to take that?
How? I mean, there have been people who argue that you should ramp up the human rights pressure. I think we're doing that already. There are people who argue you should provide covert assistance. I don't know whether we're doing that or not. I'm not sure it would be effective if we were. And then the alternative is military regime change. And unless you're ready to invade and occupy the country, that's not going to happen either. So if it happens, it's going to be an indigenous movement. It's not largely one that's going to be generated by the West. In fact, too heavy-handed of a Western role could actually make it less likely, not more likely. So I think a regime change in Iran would be awesome. I don't know how to do it. I don't know how to do it effectively, cheaply, so I just don't know what you mean.
This gentleman here, please. Wait for the microphone, please. There's a microphone behind you.
Thank you. I'm Aldous Blutis from Brooklyn College, Emeritus. My question is, Professor Kroenig, both of you, Professor Kroenig's article I read too long ago, maybe I have missed something, but my impression is that your Iran is extremely simple compared to what I understand is there on the ground. Namely, it's Ayatollah with a few other people making decisions. But Iran is a place where conservatives are fighting each other, where they are oppressing many unhappy Iranians. About 40% of the Iranian population is minorities, which are frequently raising up, and they are being suppressed. Does that have anything to do with your calculations? That's my question.
Matt, what are the implications of internal divisions in Iran for your argument?
Yeah.
It's also economically poor place.
Yeah.
I'm not that.
First, just in terms of how national security decision-making is made in Iran, the Supreme Leader is the ultimate and final authority on all national security decisions. If he takes a decision, he has the ability to impose it on the system. So influencing his calculation is what needs to be done as long as he is in power in order to convince Iran to give up its nuclear program. So it relates a little bit to the question that was asked previously, and I would agree with what Colin said in the difficulty of getting regime change in a meaningful time frame to affect the nuclear program. The one thing that I would add is that there's no guarantee that even with a different government, Iran would give up its nuclear program. The nuclear program is very popular domestically. The opposition movements in Iran all say that they would continue to support the nuclear program. So I think these are two different issues. They're both important, but I think the nuclear program, Iran's nuclear program, constitutes a threat to U.S. national security, and that should be our priority, not influencing Iranian domestic politics.
But I do think, actually, there's one way to influence domestic politics in Iran that would be very bad, and that's to do what Matt suggests. There is a domestic consensus about Iran's nuclear program, okay? Its civilian aspects. There is no consensus about weaponization. There are factions that support it, there are factions that don't, and the Supreme Leader, as far as we know, hasn't made a final decision. It is perfectly conceivable that Iran would actually settle on a virtual program. That is, to have all the components to rapidly assemble a bomb, but not actually do it, declare it, be open about it. Why might they do that? Because they could get some deterrent value from that while not bringing down the worst international repercussions, especially from the United States. So it's conceivable. I'm not saying that they're going to do it. I'm saying it's conceivable. The one thing that would settle the debate between those who think they need a weapon to deter attack and those who argue for a virtual program or a civilian program would be to get attacked. Because the hardliners within the regime to which Ayatollah Ali Khamenei is highly susceptible would make the argument that the only way to prevent it again is to weaponize. So they'd kick out the international community. The international consensus that currently has Iran in a box would be shattered, and Iran would be able to reconstitute its program. Now, he mentioned Syria. He didn't mention Iraq, which was another example that he used in his article, because in 1981, the Israelis schwacked Iraq, and then they did reconstitute their program. In fact, they reconstituted to such a degree that when inspectors showed up after the Gulf War, they were shocked at how close Saddam was to a bomb. The Iranians would do the same thing.
The gentleman on the side in the blue jacket. Right there. Thank you.
My name's Charlie Rose, but I'm not the guy on television. You've got an Arab Spring going on. I don't know if it's a quote, an Arab Spring, essentially creating alterations in the landscape of the whole region. And one landscape is obviously the military dictatorships are falling, Mubarak, Gaddafi, and then you've got the theocracies of Saudi Arabia and Iran and others. And the question is, U.S. foreign policy has basically been inept for decades in defining who our friends and who our enemies are. And the ability of the Iranian government to have a weapon is essentially to not have a spring, but essentially to essentially keep them in place to redefine the region, to essentially permitize, to make permanent the regime that's there today. So the question I have for you is really, what is the policy? The Obama administration's inept, but prior administrations have been inept as well. So what should be the policies of the United States government to influence not just the Iranians, but the whole region, such that we don't have this instability that continues for the next several decades? Because one thing is clear, the region is very, very volatile. and could be a disaster.
Thank you. I mean, the question can be asked in a slightly different way, which is, should the emphasis be on some kind of a regional peace condominium, whether it's a nuclear-free zone or what have you, that obviates the need for nuclear weapons in the first place? One argument that's been made a lot recently is the best thing you could do for Iran's nuclear program is convince the Israelis to give up theirs. Answer how you wish.
Well, maybe I'll let Matt talk about the nuclear-free zone, because he's a big proliferation guy. I would talk about I want to say something about the Arab Spring specifically. I think actually the dynamics of the Arab Spring are a powerful argument not to rush into war at this particular moment. Assad is wobbling, and if he falls, whether he's weakened, there's a civil war, or there's a soft landing and a transition, Iran is the loser in any of those equations. Hamas is already distancing itself from the so-called resistance camp, specifically Damascus, but increasingly Iran as well. And there are reasons to believe that the Arab Spring, which is very much an Arab populist movement, is really wounding Iran's appeal in the region. I think while there's a lot of uncertainty, things are not trending in Iran's direction in the region. Right? There's reason to believe a year from now Iran will be more isolated in the region than it is today, which is a reason why we shouldn't strike in the near term. I know that Matt says his argument's very conditional, but read his article. Time to attack Iran, not it might be time eventually, sometime later to attack Iran. Diplomacy has already failed. It's the least bad option to go now. There's a lot of now or never language in it. I think there's a bit of revisionism in the notion that that the argument is as conditional as Matt suggests. And rushing to war in the context of the Arab Spring throws Iran a lifeline, because it allows Iran to play the victim. It also allows them, through their retaliation against us, the Israelis and others, to rejuvenate their street cred as the champion of the resistance in the movement. And there will be some folks in Riyadh and Abu Dhabi and others who clap, all right, when we cut the head off the snake. But most on the Arab street would view this as a highly negative event. It would transform the narrative of the Arab Spring into a profoundly anti-American experience. So it's another reason not to do it now, because there is so much turmoil in the region.
Matt, you want to speak on the proliferation question?
Yes, so one of the proposals that people have put forward to solve the Iranian nuclear issue is to get a nuclear weapons-free zone in the Middle East. There are nuclear weapons-free zones in other geographical areas. The idea is that all countries in the region agree to give up nuclear weapons. So kind of a small institution nested within the nuclear nonproliferation regime. The problem with that, of course, is that Israel has a nuclear arsenal. It's estimated by outside experts that it has roughly 200 nuclear weapons. And so, a nuclear weapons-free zone in the Middle East might be something aspirational that we should shoot for, but realistically, the timeframes involved don't make that a reasonable solution to this problem. I think it's a non-starter with Israel. Israel is obviously not going to want to give up nuclear weapons. Even if it were, negotiating some kind of major international treaty like that is going to take a lot of time, and we're going to be forced, I'm afraid, to make difficult decisions on Iran's nuclear program before that would even be possible. And I would like to just respond to something that Colin said. I'm bristling a little bit about the way that he's characterizing my argument. He continues to say, I want to rush to war. I mean, the premise of my article is this what is worse question, a nuclear-armed Iran or a military strike to prevent that from happening. And my argument is if we get to that point, a strike is the least bad option. Of course, begs the question, when are we at that point, which I think Colin and I disagree on. And so I can see why Colin's trying to avoid that difficult question. It's a dilemma. I think U.S. foreign policymakers have been trying to avoid that question. Outside experts have been trying to avoid that question. No one wants to face it. But let's be realistic. It would be wonderful if diplomacy succeeds. I think it's unlikely to succeed. We're going to face this, likely going to face this question. I think we need to have an answer. So the question is, when do we get to that point? So Colin has said a number of times that we have a number of years. He appears to take comfort in the idea that what the intelligence community tells us, that we have no hard evidence that Iran has yet made a final decision to build nuclear weapons. But I think that that's highly misleading. Once a country has significant quantities of highly enriched uranium, actually fashioning a simple nuclear device is fairly easy, a simple gun-type device. So the question is, how long until Iran can have significant quantities of highly enriched uranium? Right now, we estimate that if they made that decision today, that they could have enough highly enriched uranium. If they began enriching from 20 to 90, they could have enough in about 6 months. But that timeline is shrinking over the course of the year as they bring more and more centrifuges online. By December 2012, experts estimate that that time will have shrunk to about a month, that if Iran makes the decision, it could have enough highly enriched uranium within a month. So the timelines are shrinking. Colin might be right that we have 18 months or a few years until Iran decides to dash to a nuclear weapon, but they could make the decision tomorrow. They could kick out international inspectors tomorrow, in which case we would have to make this decision tomorrow. So it's might be too early to strike, but it's certainly not too early to have this conversation.
Thank you, Matt. Since I know you two aren't going to agree on this point, I'm going to take another question. This gentleman right in front, please. Just wait for the microphone.
Alex Sadri, I'm a physician in New York City. What do you think about the article today in New York Times, the op-ed about the time is right for Israel to attack Iran?
I actually think this is something Matt and I are going to agree on. If anybody is to take military action against Iran, it should be the United States, preferably with a very large coalition. Israel shouldn't take action against Iran, both because it's not time to attack Iran.
Detect a theme here.
But also because the Israelis have far fewer capabilities than the United States military has. The chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff and others have said that Israel can maybe knock the program back 1 to 3 years. I think the lower end of that spectrum is more probable than the higher end. And so you get very little of the payoff, and you get most of the downside risk as it relates to regional dynamics, higher oil prices, regional instability, prospects for retaliation even against us, because the little Satan will get blamed by the Iranians for, the big Satan will get blamed by the Iranians for everything the little Satan does. So I think an Israeli strike is the least palatable of all options, and we just have time. We have time to make this decision. I mean, I know Matt says his article doesn't say rush into war, but there's no caveats. And when he discusses the 6-month time frame in his article, there's no caveat to it. He predicts that Iran is 6 months away from getting a bomb. He says that diplomacy and sanctions have failed. The average reader reading Matt's article comes away from it saying, we were basically screwed. Iran is inevitably going to become a nuclear power unless we take military action now, and that is simply wrong. The fact of the matter is, we may or may not know what's inside the Supreme Leader's head, but we do know that to get a weapon, he'd have to enrich to weapons grade, and we would see him doing that, because he would either have to kick out the IAEA inspectors, or he'd have to do it in plain sight. Either one would be an indication that he was going for a bomb, and we'd have plenty of time to react. And as I said, and Matt has never rebutted, he's not likely to do that, because he doesn't want to get caught. The entire program is meant to create this plausible deniability that it's a civilian program. Why? Because they don't want to bring the whole house down on them. So they're not going to rush into doing this in an overt way, which means they're probably many years away from this. And this 1-month estimate, I don't know who that estimate is from, but I would look to David Albright's.
The former deputy director of the International Atomic Energy Agency, Ali Heinonen.
Yeah, that is not a consensus of the folks who have looked at this issue. It would presume that the Iranians either had a lot of 20% LEU, or that they had installed a lot of IR-2M and IR-4 centrifuges, and they're not anywhere close to either one of those two things.
I just want to return to the Israel point for a second, because what struck me, the takeaway of that piece this morning, was the Israelis are now saying to the Americans, okay, it's time. You give us a guarantee, or we're going to do this ourselves. It's significant that Obama is speaking to AIPAC on Sunday, and that Obama and Netanyahu are meeting on Monday. And these are presumably the questions that Netanyahu is going to ask Obama. So stay tuned for early next week. Please.
Hello, my name is Dariush Manavi, and I'm an American of Iranian descent. I left the last plane before Khomeini arrived, and I've been hoping for democracy in Iran ever since. So my question is a little bit a small one and a bigger one. I think Pakistan and Israel prove every day that it's never too late because they're both nuclear powers and seem to be attacked on a regular basis and don't retaliate. So my question is it true that it's too late? Because we have taken actions that are basically cause for war against Pakistan recently, and they haven't retaliated, and they're a nuclear power. The second is your argument, sir, Matt, if I may call you that, completely whistles by the notion that if a war does actually become a ground war because we have to retaliate. We've just spent $3 trillion by some estimates, and it's completely damaged our economy. Are we in a position to take the risk of starting a war like that based on the notion that this country, which is not supposedly, or at least experts say, is not actually a threat to the U.S., and a lot of the arguments you use seem very similar to the arguments that got us into Iraq, and from the same people that argued that Iraq might cost us $12 billion rather than $1.3 trillion.
Thank you. Matt, why don't you address the first half of that first, because it gets to this critical question of whether states with nuclear weapons can be expected to behave responsibly. And there is, in fact, a track record, whether it's India fighting with Pakistan after both countries possess nuclear weapons, but were very, very careful to stay away from anything that would draw them into a larger nuclear conflict. Or whether it's the fact that the statements made by Stalin in the 40s and Mao in the 50s were arguably just as terrifying as the things that Khamenei and Ahmadinejad say today.
Yeah. Well, I think if Pakistan is anything of a model for what a nuclear-armed Iran looks like, we should all be concerned. Pakistan has provided sensitive nuclear materials and technology to Iran, Libya, and North Korea. Part of the reasons that Iran and North Korea are so far with uranium enrichment programs is because they got help from Pakistan. We've had a number of nuclear scares between Pakistan and India over the past few years. Any one of those could have escalated. The United States, U.S. officials were very concerned in each of those crises that it could escalate into nuclear war. And Pakistan's only had nuclear weapons for a little over 10 years. We haven't seen the full range of effects of what a nuclear-armed Pakistan is going to look like. We could still very well have a nuclear exchange with Pakistan. And many experts who have looked at Pakistan, there is a scholarly debate, but many experts have said that Pakistan has been more aggressive and has been more willing to attack India since it's had nuclear weapons. So I think these are all the things that we should be worried about with a nuclear-armed Iran. It could be more aggressive. We'll have a nuclear scare every few years. They'll transfer nuclear material to U.S. enemies around the world. And it's possible that we'd have nuclear war.
Thank you. It's 7 o'clock, but since we started late, I think we can go late and take a few more questions. Let me go to the gentleman on the aisle.
Thanks. My name is Rafael Matus. I'm from Argentina. I'm with La Nación newspaper. I have a very short question. How can you make diplomacy work?
It's actually a very short but pretty important, right? Look, I think in the near term, the goal needs to be to stop the Iranians from enriching 20% uranium, because that has a big effect on their timeline to a bomb. To ship, if at all possible, ship their 20% stockpile out of the country in exchange for fuel for the Tehran research reactor, maybe some medical isotopes and some other cooperation, and to freeze further installations of cascades of centrifuges into the Fordo facility in the mountain at Qom. The reason I emphasize those three as a short-term emphasis is not because it solves the nuclear challenge, but because that would hit the pause button on the things that are driving the Israeli strike clock. And so I think that's the near-term diplomatic target. The ultimate target, of course, is to find some grand bargain whereby Iran lives up to its international obligations in exchange for the international community recognizing its rights to peaceful nuclear energy use, and there we're not close to that. But I also don't think we're close to saying it's not possible. We know the broad contours of what an agreement like that would probably look like. It would probably have to accept some ultimate right of Iranian enrichment under extraordinary safeguards. It would probably, in exchange for them confirming to the IAEA that their weaponization programs have ended, full transparency, a lot of monitoring, inspectors being able to go wherever they want under the additional protocol to the IAEA and other safeguard agreements. It would probably require some type of negative security assurance from the United States and maybe other states, and there are other elements of that agreement. But that's probably an agreement that's a year or 2 or 3 away. We have to take initial steps towards rebuilding some confidence between the two sides, which is why we need to not have an Israeli strike in the near term, and we need to try to take some steps to stop some of the most threatening Iranian activities.
Let me push you there. Are you confident that a deal can be done, and why are you confident, if you are?
I actually think you could cut a deal on the 20% issue. I think on the 20% issue, stopping 20% enrichment, getting the stockpile out, and freezing at Fordo in exchange for fuel for the TRR, some discounted medical isotopes, which after all is why they say they're producing the 20% to begin with, some other technical assistance, and some promise not to do additional sanctions for some period of time. I think if you put that on the table, it is conceivable because the Iranians are under a lot of pressure at the moment. Salehi's comments by other Iranian officials. So I think it's conceivable, which is why I'm not as prepared as Matt is to dismiss diplomacy as an option.
Here in front, please.
Hi, Herb Blust. So a couple questions. First of all, is there a way that inspectors can stay in Iran and not know what's going on in Iran, so that effectively they're ignorant and some kind of program goes on in some hidden way or another, number one. Number two, what is the value of the signal to the community outside of Iran to kick the inspectors out? Would it actually cause the United States, for example, to attack Iran or not?
Thank you. I think you've addressed the second question, but not the first. How reliable are inspections?
Well, I mean, I think Matt and I actually agree with this, which is that there's a fair amount of reason to believe that they don't already have extensive covert facilities, at least for enrichment, that we don't know about, because we've been pretty good at detecting them before. And if they built them in the same way as they did before, we'd likely detect them this time around again. I oftentimes get asked this question: how do you know they don't have a completely parallel covert program? Well, if they do and we don't know about it, then taking military action against their overt facilities doesn't solve that problem. Okay? So either they have covert facilities, which we don't think they have, in which case military action doesn't make sense, or they don't have covert facilities, in which case they have to use their declared facilities, which means we'll have a lot of warning time. Even if Matt's right about the 1 month, which I think is BS, it still will take them a year to construct a weapon. So 1 month to which they would be 1 month to which they would be seen doing this, and then a year to actually craft the weapon. That's why all of these estimates come out and say 6 to 7 months for the weapons-grade uranium, but a year total for the bomb, because they have a lot of work to do to get there. So 1 month, they give us warning that they're going for a bomb, and a year before they actually have one.
We have time for about 2 more questions. You here in the front, please. Yeah.
Marty Kaysen, this is simple. A week from Wednesday, Israel attacks those facilities, tries to knock them out. They either exceed or they don't. Iran goes ballistic. You're President of the United States, either of you. What does the United States do on helping to protect Israel?
Well, So, I mean, there's a question of what I think we should do and then what I think we will do. I think if I were president in that situation, I would use it as an opportunity to go ahead and destroy the key nuclear facilities. My guess is that what the United States will do is that it would depend. That if it would depend on how Iran responded. If Iran retaliated directly against U.S. forces and ships, against U.S. bases, if it engaged in a massive kind of retaliation against Israel, I think it's very likely that the United States would get dragged into the conflict. If Iran were smart and just did a kind of limited retaliation in some way to save face, I think it's possible that the United States would stay out of the conflict. I would like to just correct one thing Colin said, if I could, because the timelines are important. So Colin says 6 months to build a weapon, but Colin's assuming that they're going for the gold-plated option. They're going to have not wait until they break out until they have enough material for a number of weapons. They have the delivery vehicles in place. They have the miniaturized warheads. 6 months is for
right so far.
6 months. 6 months is for an implosion-type device, which is a fairly sophisticated type device.
A year to an implosion device.
A gun-type device
a year.
Is very simple and could be put together in, experts estimate, about a month or 2. They're so simple the United States didn't even test it before we used it for the first time in Japan. And the international community is, there's a consensus, the intelligence community is...
Except for Director Clapper.
There's a consensus in the intelligence community that even al-Qaeda could produce a gun-type nuclear weapon. So this is something that's well within Iran's capabilities right now. It's not going to take 6 months or a year for a gun type.
Let's get another question. The lady in the back on the aisle.
Leah McFarland, not affiliated. I'd be interested to know, assuming that an attack does not occur from the US or Israel in the next few months, a year down the road or two, Ahmadinejad is out at the end of his term, if not before, given current scandals domestically. In the US, 3 of the 4 presidential candidates from the Republican Party have made very negative remarks about the Obama administration's support of Israel. They have made very bellicose remarks about Iran. How do these internal domestic considerations change, if they do, either of your interpretations of what is likely to happen?
Matt, then Colin.
So just to make sure I understood, it's how do the Republican presidential debates affect?
If a Republican were elected in the US.
Yeah. No, I think that I'll respond, then I'll let Colin respond. My hunch is that any of the Republican candidates would probably be more inclined to use force than President Obama, but that's just a hunch.
I don't know what President Obama will end up doing. I know that he hasn't shown any problem with using force thus far. Libya, the surge in Afghanistan, authorizing the raid that killed bin Laden. He's no dove on these issues, and so I take him at his word when he says that the Iranian program is unacceptable and all options are on the table. I don't know what the Republicans will do. I think their rhetoric is frankly irresponsible. It creates this aura that war is so inevitable and that they would be so quick to pull the trigger. And frankly, that's what concerns me about some of the debate on the other side here as well, that the Iranians will perceive that there's nothing they can do to avoid it. So you've backed them into a corner. A lot of the folks on the Hill are defining and trying to box any diplomatic agreement in so narrowly that it's inconceivable that you could actually have one, which means that if all you have is sanctions and war and no possibility for a diplomatic outcome, you're going to get sanctions followed by a war. And so I will tell you this. I don't know who's more likely to attack Iran, but I suspect a war is a lot more likely if at least if you believe the rhetoric from the Republican candidates.
Thank you, Colin. Now we're essentially out of time, and so I want to try one thing before we part. We should hope that this is not how policy in the White House is going to be made, but I want to call a vote. So all of those in favor of attacking Iran sometime soon, please raise your hands.
We should have taken the vote before, because we don't know.
All of those opposed? Please join me in thanking our 2 high school debate champs.